The letter shook in Serafina Vale's hand as she read it for the third time, hoping the words would change if she stared hard enough. They did not change. Her father was dead only 4 months, and now his lawyer was telling her that the estate she called home was drowning in debts she never knew existed. Candles, dresses, dinners, all of it had been bought with money that was never really there. She sat alone in the study that still smelled faintly of her father's tobacco, and for a moment, she let herself feel afraid. Then her Uncle Edmund walked in without knocking, and the fear turned into something sharper. He did not sit. He simply placed a folded paper on the desk in front of her, the way a man places a winning hand of cards, certain of victory before anyone else has looked at their cards at all. "I have found a solution," he said. "You will thank me one day." Serafina did not touch the paper. "What have you done, Uncle?" "I have arranged your marriage," he said, as though he were announcing the weather. "To the Duke of Ashbourne." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone in London had heard of Alistair Kane, the Duke of Ashbourne, though almost no one had actually spoken to him in the 2 years since his younger brother died. He did not attend balls. He did not attend dinners. He appeared at church on Sundays like a shadow, and left before anyone could catch him for conversation. Some called him cold, others called him cruel. Serafina had never met him, but she had heard enough whispered stories to build an idea of a man carved from stone, a man who felt nothing and wanted nothing. "You cannot be serious," she said. "I am entirely serious," Edmund answered. "His man of business approached me a fortnight ago. The Duke wishes to marry, quickly and quietly, and he does not care for love matches or long courtships. He wants a wife who will not trouble him. In exchange, he will settle your father's debts in full, and this house remains yours." Serafina stood so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. "You are selling me, Uncle. Say it plainly at least. Do not dress it up as kindness." Edmund's face did not soften. "I am saving you. There is a difference, whether you choose to see it or not. Without this marriage, you lose the house, you lose your name in society, and you lose whatever future you imagined for yourself. With it, you lose nothing but your pride, and pride does not keep a roof over anyone's head." She wanted to argue further, but the truth of his words sat heavy in her chest. She had seen the ledgers herself. She had counted the debts twice, hoping for a smaller number the second time. There was no smaller number. There was no other suitor lining up to marry a woman with no dowry and a family name quietly drowning in scandal. Edmund had found the only door left open, even if it was a door she never wanted to walk through. "When am I to meet him?" she asked finally, her voice flat. "Tomorrow," Edmund said. "The papers are already drawn. He wishes to sign quickly." Serafina almost laughed at the coldness of it. A man she had never spoken to wanted to sign papers binding her to him for the rest of her life, as though she were a property boundary being settled between 2 estates. She thought of every story she had heard growing up, stories where love found its way even through hardship, and she understood now, standing in her father's empty study, that those stories were written by people who had never needed to survive. That night, sleep refused to come. Serafina lay awake staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, listening to the old house creak around her the way it always had, and she thought of her father. She thought of the man who had taught her to ride before he taught her to read, who had let her sit in on his business meetings when other fathers sent their daughters away to embroider, who had always told her that a veil bent but never broke. She wondered what he would say if he could see her now, about to trade her freedom for the roof over both their heads. She liked to believe he would understand, even if it broke something in him to watch. By the time the sun rose, she had made peace with very little, but she had at least stopped crying. Tears would not soften a duke's heart, and she suspected his heart was not the kind that softened at all. The next morning came too quickly. Serafina dressed in the plainest gown she owned, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of thinking she had dressed to please a duke she had not chosen. Her maid Margaret fussed over her hair regardless, murmuring that appearances mattered even when hearts did not agree. "Appearances did not save my father's fortune," Serafina said. "I doubt they will save me." Margaret paused, brush still in hand, and met her eyes in the mirror. "No, my lady. But they may help you walk into that house today as though you have already won something, instead of as though you have already lost." Serafina considered that for a long moment, then let Margaret finish pinning her hair after all. The carriage ride to Ashbourne House felt shorter than it should have. She had expected time to gather herself, to build some kind of composure before facing the man who was about to become her husband, but the city passed by too fast, and soon she was standing before a house that looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Gray stone rose high above her, and the windows, though many, let in very little light. It was the kind of house that seemed built to keep the world out rather than welcome it in. A butler led her through corridors that smelled of polish and silence, past portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share the same unreadable expression, until they reached a study door. He knocked once, waited for a low voice to answer, and opened it. The Duke of Ashbourne did not stand when she entered. He sat behind a wide desk covered in papers, his dark head bent over a ledger, a pen moving steadily across a column of numbers. He was younger than she expected, though nothing about his manner suggested youth. His jaw was set hard, his shoulders squared like a man bracing for an argument that had not yet come. When he finally lifted his eyes to her, there was no warmth in them at all, only a kind of tired assessment, as though he were checking an item off a very long list. "Lady Vale," he said, "please sit." She did not sit. "You did not stand when I entered the room." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, quickly buried. "I did not think formality mattered a great deal between two people entering an arrangement neither of them chose." "It matters to me," she said. He studied her for a long moment, and she made herself hold his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. Finally, he gestured to the chair across from him again, and this time she sat, though only because her legs had begun to tremble, and she did not wish him to see it. "Then let us be honest with one another," he said, setting down his pen. "I require a wife. I do not require companionship, conversation, or affection. I require someone who will manage this household with competence, produce an heir in time, and otherwise leave me to my own affairs. In exchange, your family's debts will be settled, your home will remain yours, and you will want for nothing material for the rest of your life." Serafina felt anger rise in her chest, hot and immediate. "You speak of me as though I were a piece of furniture you are purchasing for a room." "I speak of you honestly," he said, his voice even. "I find dishonesty far crueler than plain speech. Would you prefer I pretend affection I do not feel? I would prefer you treat me as a person, Your Grace, not a solution to an inconvenient problem." For a moment, something like respect passed through his eyes, there and gone before she could be certain of it. "Very well. You are a person, Lady Vale, and I am telling you plainly what this marriage will and will not be. I think you would rather know the truth now than discover disappointment later." She wanted to argue further, wanted to tell him that a marriage without warmth was no marriage at all, but she thought of the ledgers again, of the debts, of Margaret and the other servants who depended on her family's household for their own livelihoods. She thought of the home her mother had once filled with laughter before illness took her, the home Serafina refused to lose to strangers and creditors. "When do you wish to sign the papers?" she asked instead. "Today, if you are willing." Somewhere beyond the study door, a clock ticked steadily, marking the seconds of a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Serafina found herself studying the Duke's face while he waited for her answer, searching for some crack in the stone, some sign of the man beneath the title, but he gave her nothing. His expression remained as closed as the heavy curtains behind him, and she understood then that if she wanted to find the person hiding inside Alistair Kane, she would have to look far harder than a single afternoon would allow. She looked at him, this stranger who would soon hold her name and her future in his hands, and she made a silent promise to herself. She would sign his papers, she would wear his ring, but she would not become invisible in his house, would not fold herself into the small, quiet shape he clearly expected of her. Whatever coldness lived in this man, she would not let it swallow her whole. "I am willing," she said, and reached for the pen. Their fingers brushed as he passed it to her, brief and impersonal, but she saw his jaw tighten at the contact, saw something pass behind his eyes that he quickly hid away again. She signed her name beneath his, the ink still wet when the butler returned to witness the agreement, and just like that, the course of her life changed with nothing more than the scratch of a pen against paper. Outside, rain had begun to fall against the tall windows of Ashbourne House, and Serafina thought, with a strange and stubborn calm, that whatever kind of wife the Duke expected her to be, she intended to surprise him. The wedding, he informed her before she left, would take place in 3 weeks. She nodded once, gathered her gloves, and walked out without looking back, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire way to the door. Whatever he thought he was gaining in this contract, Serafina intended to make certain he had not gained a woman who would disappear quietly into his cold gray house. She had lost her father, her fortune, and now her choice in marriage. She would not lose herself as well. The church bells rang cold and clear over London on the morning of the wedding, and Serafina Vale stood at the back of the small chapel, feeling as though she were about to attend a funeral rather than her own marriage. There were no crowds of well-wishers, no flowers spilling from every corner the way she had once imagined for her wedding day as a girl. There was only a handful of witnesses, a stern-faced priest, and the Duke of Ashbourne waiting at the altar in black, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. She walked toward him alone. Her Uncle Edmund had offered to give her away, but she had refused him that satisfaction, choosing instead to walk the short aisle by herself, her spine straight, her chin high. If this marriage was going to be a transaction, she would at least walk into it on her own 2 feet. Alistair watched her approach with an expression she could not read. When she reached him, he offered the barest nod, and the priest began the ceremony without any of the warmth such words usually carried. Vows were spoken, rings were exchanged. His hand was warm against hers for the brief moment it took to slide the cold gold band onto her finger, and she noticed, despite herself, that his fingers did not shake the way hers did. Within the hour, it was finished. She was no longer Lady Vale. She was the Duchess of Ashbourne, bound by law to a man who had spoken perhaps 20 words to her since she arrived. The wedding breakfast that followed was a quiet, stiff affair, attended by a few of Alistair's distant relations who studied Serafina with open curiosity, whispering behind gloved hands about the sudden marriage and what it might mean. She held her composure through every course, through every pointed question about her family's finances disguised as polite conversation, and by the time the carriage arrived to take her to her new home, she felt as though she had run a great distance without moving an inch. Ashbourne House looked no less forbidding in the evening light than it had the day she signed the papers. Alistair led her through the entrance hall in silence, his pace brisk, as though he wished to complete this final duty of the day as quickly as possible. He stopped outside a set of doors on the west side of the house. "These rooms are yours," he said. "You will find everything you require within them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, will see to anything else you need." Serafina looked at the doors, then back at him. "And your rooms, your grace?" "The east wing," he said. "We need not trouble each other's spaces. We are married," she said carefully, "not strangers sharing a house." Something tightened in his jaw. "I did not agree to this marriage for companionship, Duchess. I agreed to it because I require an heir, and because it settled a debt of honor I owed your late father, who once did my family a great kindness I never had the chance to repay. Beyond that, I ask only that you manage this household competently and stay out of my affairs. In return, I will stay out of yours." The word heir landed heavily in the silence between them, and Serafina felt her face heat with embarrassment and anger both. "You speak of an heir as though it were a line item in your ledgers." "I speak of it because it is the truth," he said. "I will not insult you with false romance neither of us feels." "And if I wanted something more than a business arrangement?" she asked. "Would you even consider it?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something almost like sorrow passed behind his eyes before he shuttered it away completely. "I have nothing more to give, Duchess. I would rather disappoint you honestly now than deceive you slowly over years." He left her standing in the corridor outside her new rooms, his footsteps fading toward the east wing, and Serafina stood alone in the vast, unfamiliar house that was now supposedly her home, feeling more like an unwelcome guest than a wife. That night, she did not cry. She had promised herself she would not give this house or its master the satisfaction of her tears. Instead, she unpacked her belongings herself, refusing the maid's help, arranging her books and her mother's old writing desk exactly as she wished, marking the room as hers in whatever small ways she could manage. The following morning she rose early and made her way down to the breakfast room, uninvited. She found Alistair already seated, a newspaper in one hand, a cup of tea untouched beside him. He glanced up when she entered, clear surprise crossing his features before he masked it. "You are awake early, Duchess," he said. "I am hungry," she answered simply, taking the seat across from him without waiting for permission. "I assumed the breakfast room was not part of the east wing you wished me to avoid." A muscle in his cheek moved, something that might have been the ghost of amusement, quickly suppressed. "It is not." They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sound the soft clink of silverware against china and the rustle of his newspaper. Serafina studied him from beneath her lashes, trying to understand the man she had married. He did not seem cruel, not truly, not in the way the gossip in London had painted him. He seemed instead like a man who had built high walls around himself and had grown so used to living behind them that he no longer remembered how to lower them, even briefly. "Your steward informed me yesterday that the tenant cottages on the eastern edge of the estate have not been repaired in over a year," she said, breaking the silence deliberately. "The roofs leak. Families are living with damp walls through the winter." Alistair lowered his newspaper slightly. "That is a matter for the steward to handle." "The steward told me it was a matter for you to approve." and that you have not answered his letters on the subject in months." His eyes narrowed slightly, though not with anger, more with the surprise of being questioned so directly. "You have been speaking with my steward. I have been managing your household, as you instructed me to do," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "That includes the welfare of the people who depend on this estate, unless you wish to tell me that instruction did not truly mean anything at all." For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Then, finally, he set down his newspaper entirely. "Draw up the repair costs. I will review them this afternoon." It was a small victory, barely a crack in the wall he had built, but Serafina felt something like triumph all the same. She had expected him to dismiss her, to remind her of her place in cold, clipped words, and instead he had listened, however grudgingly. Over the following days, she continued to assert herself in small, deliberate ways. She reorganized the household accounts, finding several instances of waste that the previous housekeeper had allowed to continue unchecked. She spoke directly with the kitchen staff about meals, insisting on proper provisions for the servants rather than the meager scraps they had apparently grown used to receiving. She visited the tenant cottages herself, despite Mrs. Whitfield's clear disapproval of a duchess walking muddy lanes in a plain wool coat, and she listened to the families there describe hardships that no one in the great house above them had ever bothered to ask about. One afternoon, while reviewing the household ledgers in the small study she had claimed as her own, Serafina came across an old entry that made her pause. A payment, made regularly every quarter for the past 2 years, listed only as a private allowance with no further explanation. She asked Mrs. Whitfield about it over tea, keeping her tone light and curious rather than demanding. Mrs. Whitfield's face grew carefully blank, the way faces did when servants had learned not to speak of certain things. "That is not a matter I am permitted to discuss, Your Grace." "Permitted by whom?" "By His Grace himself, madam. It has always been so, since before I came into service here." Serafina let the matter rest for the moment, though she filed the strange payment away in her mind alongside every other small mystery this house seemed determined to guard. There was the locked door on the 3rd floor that no servant would enter. There was the way every portrait of the previous duke's younger son had been quietly removed from the main hallways, though faint marks remained on the wallpaper where frames had once hung. There was the way the entire staff seemed to walk more carefully whenever a certain date on the calendar approached, as though bracing for a storm only they could see coming. She did not ask Alistair about any of it directly, not yet. She sensed, with the same instinct that had guided her through her father's collapsing fortune, that pushing too hard too quickly would only drive him further behind his walls. Patience, she decided, would serve her better than confrontation, at least for now. Instead, she continued her quiet campaign of small assertions. She invited 2 of the tenant families to bring their concerns directly to the house, rather than waiting for the steward's infrequent visits, a decision that scandalized Mrs. Whitfield, but which Serafina refused to reverse. She began taking her afternoon tea in the drawing room rather than her private study, making certain that anyone passing through the house would see the new Duchess was very much present, and very much awake to everything happening around her. Word of her actions reached Alistair, of course. Servants talked, and a house as quiet as Ashbourne House carried whispers easily through its long corridors. She saw him watching her sometimes across the length of the dining table, an unreadable expression on his face, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into their marriage, she found him standing at the window of the library as she passed by, staring out at the darkening grounds with an expression of such quiet grief that she stopped without meaning to. "Your Grace?" she said softly. He turned, and for just a moment, before the mask slid back into place, she saw something raw in his eyes, something that looked very much like loneliness. "It is nothing, Duchess," he said. "You should retire. It grows late." She did not move immediately. "You do not have to carry everything alone, you know. Even dukes are permitted help now and then." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or something closer to longing, but he said nothing more, only inclined his head slightly and turned back to the window. Serafina left him there, but as she walked away, she found herself wondering, for the first time since she had signed those papers, what exactly had happened in this house to build a man so thoroughly closed against the world. Whatever it was, she decided, she intended to find out. Not because she owed him kindness after the coldness of his proposal, but because some stubborn part of her refused to believe that any man could be born entirely without warmth. Somewhere beneath the ice, she suspected, Alistair Kane was still capable of feeling something. She only needed to be patient enough and brave enough to find it. Later that same week, a letter arrived for Alistair, bearing a seal Serafina did not recognize, delivered by a rider who refused to wait for a reply, and left before Mrs. Whitfield could even offer him refreshment. Alistair read the letter alone in his study, and when he emerged an hour later, his face had gone the color of old ash, his hands clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles had turned white. He said nothing to her about it, retreating instead to the stables and riding out into the darkening evening without a word to anyone, not returning until well past midnight. Serafina waited up, though she told herself it was only concern for the household's order, not concern for him specifically. When she heard his footsteps finally return along the corridor, she did not go to him. She only listened until the sound of his study door closing told her he was safely, if unhappily, home. Whatever secrets lived in this house, she understood now that they ran far deeper than a cold marriage of convenience. Something had happened here, something the entire household still carried like a wound that had never properly healed, and Alistair Kane was carrying the heaviest part of it entirely alone. She found herself, against every instinct toward self-protection she had built over the past difficult months, beginning to care what that burden was, and beginning to wish, however reluctantly, that he did not have to carry it by himself. The locked door on the third floor had haunted Serafina's thoughts for weeks, and on a quiet afternoon when Alistair had ridden out to inspect the eastern fields, she finally allowed herself to climb the narrow staircase that led to it. The corridor was colder there than the rest of the house, as though the very air had been sealed away along with whatever lay behind that door. She tried the handle out of curiosity more than expectation, certain it would be locked as always, and was startled when it turned easily beneath her hand. The room beyond was small, a young man's bedroom left exactly as it must have been years ago, dust thick on every surface except a small writing desk near the window, which looked as though it had been touched far more recently than anything else in the room. Books lined a shelf, their spines cracked from use rather than neglect. A riding coat hung over the back of a chair, and on the desk sat a single framed portrait of two young men, brothers clearly, both smiling in a way Serafina had never once seen on Alistair's face. She understood, standing there in the dust and silence, that this had been his brother's room. A small stack of letters sat tied with faded ribbon in the desk drawer, and though every instinct told her this was not hers to read, she found herself untying the ribbon with careful fingers. The letters were addressed to Alistair, written in a younger, looser hand than his own, full of small jokes about horses and tailors and a girl named Charlotte the writer clearly fancied. And then, near the bottom of the stack, a letter with a different tone entirely, dated only days before what Serafina now understood must have been his death. "Something is wrong with the arrangement Father made with Whitmore," the letter read. "I do not trust the man, and I mean to speak with him myself before you return from London. Do not worry yourself over it, brother. I only wished you to know, in case I am wrong to trust my own instincts on this." Serafina sat with the letter in her hands for a long time, piecing together fragments of gossip she had heard whispered at the wedding breakfast and since, about a hunting accident that had claimed the younger Kane brother 2 years past. An accident, everyone called it, though something in the careful, controlled way the household avoided the subject entirely suggested otherwise. She was still sitting there, lost in thought, when she heard footsteps on the stairs, quick and heavy, followed by Alistair's voice, sharp with an anger she had never heard from him before. "What are you doing in here?" He stood in the doorway, his face white with fury, or perhaps something closer to pain, wearing the mask of fury. Serafina rose slowly, the letter still in her hand, and though every instinct told her to apologize immediately, to retreat, something stubborn in her refused to shrink. "I found the room unlocked," she said. "I did not mean to trespass." "This room has been locked for 2 years," he said, crossing the space between them in 3 quick strides, and taking the letter from her hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he did. "No one enters this room. No one touches his things. Alistair," she said, using his given name for the first time since their wedding day, and something in his expression flickered at the sound of it. Was it truly an accident, the way he died? His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "That is not your concern." "I am your wife," she said, refusing to back down, though her heart hammered painfully against her ribs. "You told me yourself this house and everything in it is my concern now. You cannot ask me to manage your household and then forbid me from understanding the grief that lives inside its walls." "You know nothing about it," he snapped, his voice rising for the first time since she had met him. "You did not know him. You did not stand in that field and see him lying there. Did not have to tell our mother that her youngest son would never come home again. You have no right to walk into this room and pretend you understand anything at all." Serafina flinched at the force of his words, but she held her ground. "Then tell me, Make me understand, instead of shutting me out the way you shut out everyone else. I am not asking to intrude on your grief, Alistair. I am asking to help you carry it, if you would only let me." For a long moment, he said nothing, breathing hard. The letter crumpled slightly in his tight grip. Then, slowly, the anger seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind something far more exhausted, far more human than she had ever seen in him before. He sank into the desk chair, the same chair his brother must have once sat in, and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. "His name was Edward," he said quietly, so quietly she had to step closer to hear him. "He was 3 years younger than me. Everyone said he was the better version of our family, the one who could charm a room without trying, the one our father actually smiled around. I always thought, if either of us deserved to inherit this house, it should have been him." Serafina sat carefully on the edge of the bed, saying nothing, giving him the space to continue. "We were hunting on the northern edge of the estate, the way we did every autumn since we were boys," Alistair continued. "A shot went wide. That is what everyone was told, what I told everyone, myself included, for a very long time. A shot went wide, and Edward was in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and it was simply terrible, terrible luck. But you do not believe that," Serafina said softly. Alistair lowered his hand, and his eyes, when they met hers, were red-rimmed and raw in a way that made her chest ache. "No, I do not believe that at all. Edward had written to me, days before, about a business arrangement our father had made with a man named Whitmore, some investment in shipping that Edward did not trust. He meant to confront the man himself, and days later, he was dead in a field surrounded by men who all swore they had seen nothing unusual at all." "Did you ever investigate it, Whitmore?" "I tried," Alistair said, his voice dropping further, edged now with old, bitter frustration. "But Whitmore had powerful friends, and I had a grieving family, and an estate suddenly dropped onto my shoulders with no warning at all. Every path I tried to follow closed before I could walk very far down it. Eventually I stopped trying, because I could not grieve my brother and fight a battle I had no resources to win at the same time. I chose to protect what remained of my family instead. I locked this room, and I locked away the questions along with it, and I told myself that was the responsible thing to do." "Who was this man, Whitmore?" Serafina asked, choosing her words carefully, aware that she was walking through territory Alistair had guarded for 2 years. "What sort of man was he, before all this?" Alistair let out a slow breath, staring at the crumpled letter still in his grip as though it might offer answers it had never contained. "A merchant, originally. He made his fortune in shipping, or claimed to, and my father trusted him because they had known each other since university. Whitmore proposed an investment scheme involving several vessels bound for the colonies, promising returns that, looking back, I should have questioned the moment I first heard the numbers. My father was not a foolish man, but he wanted to believe an old friend would not deceive him. And Edward saw through it. Edward always saw through things faster than the rest of us," Alistair said, and something almost like a smile ghosted across his face before disappearing again. "He had a talent for numbers our father never fully appreciated. He found discrepancies in Whitmore's accounts, small at first, the kind of thing that could be explained away as clerical error, except there were too many of them, all pointing the same direction. He meant to confront Whitmore quietly, without involving our father, to spare him the embarrassment of having trusted the wrong man. And instead he never had the chance," Alistair finished, his voice hollow. 3 men were present that day in the field, Whitmore among them, though he claimed afterward he had been nowhere near the shooting when it happened. The other 2 men worked for Whitmore directly, hired hands rather than gentlemen of standing, and both gave accounts that matched each other so precisely I always suspected they had rehearsed the story beforehand. There was no investigation worth the name. My father was too broken by grief to demand one, and I was too young, too inexperienced in matters of law and influence, to force the question against men who had money enough to make inconvenient truths disappear. Serafina felt anger stir in her chest on his behalf, sharp and protective in a way that surprised her with its intensity. "That is not justice. That is simply money purchasing silence." "That is precisely what it was," Alistair agreed. "And I have carried the shame of allowing it for 2 years. I told myself I was protecting what remained of my family by not pursuing it further. But some nights I wonder if I was only protecting myself from having to face a fight I was afraid I could not win." "You were young," Serafina said gently. "You had just lost your brother and inherited responsibility for an entire estate in the same terrible week. No one could have carried all of that and fought a war against a wealthy man at the very same time." "Perhaps," he said, though he did not sound entirely convinced. "But Edward deserved better than silence. He deserved better than a room locked away and a truth buried alongside him. Serafina reached out, hesitating only a moment before she covered his hand with hers. He did not pull away, though she felt him go very still at the contact. "That is not weakness, Alistair," she said. "Choosing to protect your family instead of chasing a fight you could not win, that is not weakness. But carrying all of this alone, for 2 years, without a single person to share the weight of it, that is not strength either. That is only loneliness wearing strength's clothing." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as though seeing something he had not expected to find. "Why do you care? I gave you nothing when we married. I offered you a cold arrangement and cold rooms in a cold house. You owe me nothing beyond what the papers require." "Because I do not think you are the man London believes you to be," she said honestly. "I think you built these walls because grief taught you that caring for people means eventually losing them, and it was easier to stop caring than to risk that pain again. But I do not think a truly cold man would have kept his brother's room exactly as it was for 2 years. I do not think a truly cold man would still be grieving this hard, this quietly, all this time later." Something shifted in his expression, a crack spreading slowly through stone that had held firm for 2 long years. He turned his hand beneath hers, threading their fingers together in a small, careful gesture that felt far more intimate than anything that had passed between them since their wedding day. "I do not know how to be anything other than what I have become," he admitted quietly. "I do not know how to let people close without fearing I will lose them the way I lost him." "You do not have to know how, all at once," Serafina said. "You only have to be willing to try." They sat together in Edward's old room as the afternoon light shifted and dimmed outside the window, and though nothing was resolved, though the questions surrounding his brother's death remained as unanswered as they had been for 2 years, something between them had changed. The distance he had built so carefully had cracked, just slightly, just enough to let a little warmth through. Before she left the room that evening, Alistair caught her hand once more at the doorway. "Serafina." It was the first time he had used her given name at all, and she felt it land somewhere deep in her chest, warmer than she expected. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not looking away." She smiled, small and genuine. "I do not intend to start now, Your Grace." As she walked back down the narrow staircase toward the main house, Serafina found herself thinking not of the coldness she had expected to spend her life enduring, but of the man she had glimpsed beneath it, a man capable of deep loyalty, deep grief, and perhaps, given time and patience, something warmer still. Whatever had happened to Edward Kane, whatever secrets Whitmore's name still guarded, she resolved to help Alistair find the truth, not because the papers bound her to his household, but because she had begun, quietly and against every careful defense she had built for herself, to care what happened to the man behind the title. That night, for the first time since her wedding, she did not eat dinner alone. Alistair joined her at the table, and though their conversation remained careful, hesitant, full of long pauses neither of them quite knew how to fill, it was conversation all the same, the first real bridge built across the cold distance that had separated them since the day they signed those papers. Mrs. Whitfield, serving the second course herself rather than sending a footman, could not entirely hide her surprise at finding the Duke and Duchess seated together, speaking in low, unhurried voices, something that had not happened once in all the weeks since the wedding. She said nothing of it, of course, but Serafina caught the flicker of quiet hope in the older woman's eyes before she withdrew from the room, and understood that the staff of Ashbourne House had been waiting, perhaps even longer than she herself had, for some sign of thaw in their master's carefully guarded heart. Later, as the candles burned low and the servants had long since retired for the night, Alistair walked her to the doors of her rooms, an unfamiliar gesture that neither of them commented on directly. He paused there, hand resting lightly against the doorframe, as though weighing whether to say something further. "I have not spoken of Edward to anyone in 2 years," he admitted quietly. "Not truly. Not the way I spoke of him to you today." "I am glad you did," Serafina said. "Grief kept alone tends to grow heavier, not lighter. Perhaps sharing it, even a little, will make the weight easier to bear." He studied her for a long moment in the flickering candlelight, something unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "You are not at all what I expected, Duchess. Nor are you, Your Grace," she answered, a small smile tugging at her mouth despite the heaviness of the evening's revelations. He almost smiled back, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly before old habit pulled it back into its usual careful line. He bid her good night and retreated toward the east wing, and Serafina stood watching him go, understanding that trust, once broken as thoroughly as his had been, could not be rebuilt in a single afternoon. But a beginning had been made. A door cracked open after 2 long years sealed shut, and she intended to see where it might lead. The ballroom at Lady Pemberton's townhouse blazed with candlelight when Seraphina arrived on Alistair's arm, the first grand social event they had attended together since their wedding. Heads turned the moment they entered, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass, and Seraphina understood that every eye in the room was measuring them, weighing the strange match between the reclusive duke and the girl whose family fortune had collapsed. She held her chin high and let them look. They had barely made their way past the receiving line when a voice, honeyed and sharp all at once, cut through the surrounding chatter. "Alistair, how very unexpected to see you out in society again." Seraphina turned to find a striking woman approaching, golden-haired and dressed in a shade of blue that seemed designed to catch every candle's light. Her smile was warm, practiced, the kind that never quite reached the eyes behind it. "Camilla," Alistair said, his voice carefully neutral, though Seraphina felt his arm tense slightly beneath her hand. "You must be the new Duchess," Camilla said, turning her attention to Seraphina with an appraising look that lasted a fraction too long. "Lady Camilla Ashworth. Alistair and I have known each other since we were children. Our families always assumed we would marry, before circumstances changed so suddenly." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the direction of the 3rd floor of Ashbourne House, though they were nowhere near it, a pointed reference Seraphina did not miss. "How fortunate for you that his standards seem to have relaxed a great deal since then." The insult was wrapped in silk, but an insult all the same, and Seraphina felt heat rise in her chest. She smiled sweetly regardless, refusing to let Camilla see the sting had landed. "How fortunate indeed," Seraphina replied smoothly, "that his Grace's standards were never so shallow as to depend entirely on a family's bank ledgers. I understand that is a rather more common measure among certain circles than genuine character." Something flickered in Camilla's eyes, surprise quickly masked by amusement. "Sharp tongue for a contract wife. I did not realize marriage vows came with an exception for honesty," Seraphina said. "Perhaps you were taught differently." A few nearby guests, close enough to catch the exchange, hid smiles behind their fans. Camilla's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before smoothing back into practiced grace. "We shall have to become better acquainted, Duchess. I do so love learning what draws a man like Alistair to marry so quickly, and so quietly." "Convenient timing, mostly," Seraphina said, "and genuine respect. Both rather rare qualities, I find, though perhaps more common than certain other things people claim to have shared for years without ever quite managing to secure a proposal." Camilla's smile finally cracked at the edges, and she excused herself with a stiff nod, retreating into the crowd with far less grace than she had arrived with. Luster, silent through the entire exchange, turned to look at Seraphina with an expression she could not entirely place, something between astonishment and reluctant admiration. "You did not need to defend me," he said quietly once they had moved toward a quieter corner of the room. "I was not only defending you," Seraphina said, "I was defending myself. She meant to make me small in front of a room full of strangers, and I do not intend to let anyone do that to me, whatever title she believes gives her the right." Something warm passed across Alistair's face, brief but unmistakable. "Remind me never to underestimate you, Duchess." "You would do well to remember that lesson," she said, allowing herself a small smile. The evening did not end there, however. Camilla, it seemed, was not a woman easily discouraged, and over the following weeks she found excuse after excuse to appear wherever Alistair and Seraphina were expected, at the opera, at garden parties, at the modest dinners hosted by families eager to maintain connection to the Ashbourne name. Each time, her needling grew slightly sharper, her comments about contract marriages and convenient arrangements, delivered with just enough sweetness to make direct offense difficult to claim. At a garden party hosted by the Marchioness of Denbigh, Camilla cornered Seraphina near the rose hedges while Alistair was occupied speaking with several gentlemen about matters of business, her voice pitched low enough that only Seraphina could hear the true edge beneath her pleasant tone. "You must understand," Camilla said, examining her gloves with studied casualness, "that Alistair and I were promised to each other long before his brother's death changed everything. Our fathers had an understanding. I loved him once, in the way young girls love the idea of a future already decided for them. When Edward died and everything fell apart, Alistair pulled away from everyone, myself included. I have simply been waiting, patiently, for the man I once knew to return. Then I am afraid your patience has been spent waiting for a version of him that circumstances required to change," Seraphina replied evenly. "People are not obligated to remain the same simply because someone once decided they preferred them a certain way." "You speak as though you understand him." Camilla said, a brittle edge creeping into her voice now. You have been married a matter of weeks. I knew him for years before you ever set foot in that house. Knowing someone for years is not the same as knowing them at all, Serafina said gently, though she did not back down an inch. I suspect you knew the boy he was before grief reshaped him. I am only beginning to know the man he has become since. Those may not be the same person, however much you might wish otherwise. Camilla's composure slipped further, something almost desperate flashing across her features before she smoothed it away. He will tire of playing the devoted husband eventually. Contracts built on debt rarely survive once the debt itself feels repaid. Perhaps, Serafina allowed, or perhaps he will surprise you, the way he has already begun to surprise me. Either way, Lady Ashworth, I do not intend to spend my marriage anxious over a future you seem far more invested in than I am. She left Camilla standing among the roses and returned to Alistair's side, saying nothing of the exchange, though she noticed him watching her with quiet curiosity for the remainder of the afternoon, as though sensing something had passed between the two women that she had chosen not to share. At a dinner hosted by Lord Pemberton some weeks later, Camilla's patience finally seemed to run entirely out. Tell me, Duchess, she said across the table, loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear clearly, does it trouble you at all, knowing your husband married you only to settle an old debt, rather than for any true affection? I imagine it must be difficult, living in a house where you were never truly wanted. The table fell silent, several guests exchanging uncomfortable glances, waiting to see how the young Duchess would respond to such a public, calculated cruelty. Serafina felt her heart pound, but she kept her expression composed, refusing to give Camilla the reaction she was so clearly hunting for. Before she could answer, however, Alistair set down his glass with deliberate calm, his voice cutting across the table with a quiet authority that silenced every other conversation in the room. My wife, he said, was not wanted for the reasons you seem to imagine, Camilla, but she is wanted now, and increasingly so with every week that passes. I would think carefully before speaking of my marriage again in this manner, particularly at a table where I am present to hear it. Camilla's face drained of color, the confident smile she had worn all evening finally, completely gone. I only meant— I know precisely what you meant, Alistair said, his tone leaving no room for further argument. I would ask that it not happen again. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange, charged silence, Camilla speaking little for the remainder of the evening, her earlier confidence entirely deflated. When the carriage finally carried Serafina and Alistair home, she turned to him in the darkness of the cab, unable to entirely hide her surprise. You did not need to defend me so publicly, she said, echoing his own words back at him from weeks before. You could have simply let it pass. I could have, Alistair agreed, his gaze steady on hers even in the dim light. But I found, watching her speak to you that way, that I did not wish to let it pass at all. You have managed my household with more competence and more care than anyone I have employed in years. You have shown more courage walking into my brother's room than most grown men would manage. I will not sit silent while someone attempts to diminish that. Serafina felt something shift and warm inside her chest, a feeling she had not expected to find in this marriage of convenience, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Careful, Your Grace. Someone might begin to think you actually care. Someone might be correct, he said quietly, and though he looked away quickly afterward, as though startled by his own admission, the words settled between them and remained, unspoken but undeniable, for the rest of the ride home. In the days that followed, the household staff noticed the change most of all. Mrs. Whitfield remarked to the cook that the Duke had begun taking his morning tea in the breakfast room rather than alone in his study, that he had started asking after Serafina's day with something that sounded remarkably like genuine interest rather than polite obligation. The steward noted that repairs to the tenant cottages had been approved without delay, that the Duke had personally ridden out to inspect the work himself, something he had not troubled to do in years before his marriage. Camilla did not appear at any further gatherings that season, whether by her own choice or by quiet arrangement Serafina never learned, and did not particularly care to ask. What mattered far more was the way Alistair had begun, slowly and carefully, to let down the walls he had spent 2 years building around himself. He still carried his grief, still guarded certain rooms and certain memories with the same fierce protectiveness as before, but something had shifted between them, a warmth that had not existed in the cold study where they signed their marriage papers, growing steadily now like the first fragile green shoots after a long, hard winter. Serafina found herself, against every careful expectation she had walked into this marriage with, beginning to look forward to the quiet evenings they now spent together, the small conversations over dinner, The way his rare, genuine smile had begun to appear more and more often when she said something that caught him off guard. She had come into this house prepared to defy a cold, distant duke at every turn, prepared to protect herself from a marriage built on nothing but obligation and debt. One evening, as autumn settled fully over the estate and the gardens outside Ashbourne House began shedding their final leaves, Alistair found her in the library, curled into a chair with one of her mother's old books open across her lap. He lingered in the doorway for a moment before entering, an unfamiliar hesitance in his usually measured stride. "May I join you?" he asked. She glanced up, surprised by the request, and gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Of course." He sat, though he did not immediately reach for a book of his own, instead watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the closest thing he allowed himself to open curiosity. "Camilla spoke to you, at the garden party. I saw her corner you near the roses." Serafina closed her book gently, unsurprised he had noticed after all. "She did. What did she say?" "Nothing you need concern yourself with," Serafina said, though she softened the words with a small smile. "She is only afraid of a future she no longer controls. I do not think she is truly cruel, only frightened, and frightened people often say sharper things than they mean." Alistair studied her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his features. "You are remarkably generous toward a woman who has done nothing but attempt to make you feel unwelcome since the moment we met her." "Generosity costs me nothing," Serafina said simply. "And I would rather spend my energy building something with you than spend it resenting someone whose opinion means very little to either of us." Something in his expression softened further, the careful distance he had maintained for so long, thinning into something warmer, more unguarded than she had yet seen from him. "I find myself grateful, more each day, that my uncle's arrangement led me to you specifically, and not to anyone else my family might have chosen." Serafina felt her pulse quicken at the quiet sincerity in his voice. "That sounds dangerously close to affection, Your Grace." "Perhaps it is," he admitted, and this time he did not look away from the words, holding her gaze steadily instead, as though testing how it felt to say something honest and let it remain standing between them, unhidden, for the very first time. She had not expected to find herself, instead, slowly and carefully falling for the very man she had been so determined never to let hurt her. The letter fell from the pages of an old ledger Serafina had been reviewing in the estate office, slipping out onto the floor as though it had been waiting years for someone to finally find it. She had been searching for a record of the tenant repairs, nothing more, but the moment she saw the handwriting on the folded paper, she recognized it immediately as the same careful, looping script from the letters in Edward's desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. The letter was not addressed to Alistair this time, but to their late father, and dated only 2 days before Edward's death. "Father," it began, "I have found proof that Whitmore has been falsifying the shipping manifests for the past 18 months, claiming losses at sea for cargo that was never loaded in the first place, then pocketing the insurance payments while selling the actual goods privately through a second, unregistered account. I have copies of the true manifests, obtained through a clerk at the shipping office who owed me a favor. I mean to confront him directly, though I confess I am nervous about how a man capable of such deception might react to being caught. If anything should happen to me before I have the chance to explain this properly, know that the true manifests are hidden inside the false bottom of my writing desk, beneath the drawer where I keep my correspondence." Serafina's breath caught in her throat. She had gone through that desk herself, weeks ago, and had found nothing beyond the letters. She had never thought to check for a hidden compartment. She found Alistair in his study and placed the letter before him without a word. He read it twice, his face growing paler with each pass, before he looked up at her with an expression caught somewhere between grief and fury. "A false bottom," he said quietly. "I never thought to look." They climbed the stairs to Edward's room together, the first time Alistair had entered it since the day Serafina found him there weeks before. His hands shook as he ran his fingers along the underside of the writing desk drawer, searching for a seam, a catch, anything, until finally something gave way beneath his touch, and a thin panel slid open, revealing a small bundle of papers that had sat hidden and waiting for 2 long years. The manifests told the same story Edward's letter had promised. Cargo listed as lost at sea that had, in fact, never left the London docks at all, sold instead through private buyers while insurance companies paid out claims for goods that were never truly missing. Whitmore had built a second fortune on lies, using the Kane family's trust and their father's old friendship as cover for years of quiet theft, and when Edward had come close to exposing it, he had died in a field on a hunting trip that had never quite made sense to anyone who examined it closely. "This is enough," Alistair said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is proof enough to bring formal charges, finally, after 2 years of silence." "It will not be simple," Serafina warned, though her own heart pounded with a mixture of fear and fierce hope. "A man capable of murder to protect a fortune built on fraud will not surrender that fortune quietly. If he learns we have this evidence before we are ready to act, he may do something desperate to bury it, along with anyone who holds it." That evening, before Alistair departed for London, they sat together going through the recovered manifests page by page, cross-referencing each falsified entry against records Alistair still kept from his father's time, managing the estate's various investments. The scale of Whitmore's deception became clearer with every page they turned. Thousands of pounds diverted over years, dozens of families and business partners deceived alongside the Kane household, all of it hidden beneath the respectable veneer of a man well regarded throughout London's merchant circles. "He has friends in high places," Alistair said grimly, setting down one particularly damning page. "Members of Parliament who invested alongside my father, judges who dine at his table twice a year. Bringing formal charges against a man this well-connected will not be a simple matter, even with proof this clear." "Then we make certain the proof is undeniable," Serafina said. "And we make certain enough people know of it that burying the truth becomes impossible, whatever friends he calls upon. A single accusation can be dismissed. A mountain of evidence, shared with the right people at the right time, cannot." Alistair looked at her with something like awe. "You think like a general planning a campaign, not a duchess managing a household." "Perhaps managing a household and planning a campaign require more of the same skills than anyone gives credit for," she said, allowing herself a small, tired smile despite the gravity of the evening. "Both require patience, careful attention to detail, and a willingness to fight for what matters even when the odds seem poorly stacked against you." He took her hand across the desk, his thumb tracing gently over her knuckles. "I am fortunate you agreed to sign those papers, however little either of us wanted to at the time. We did not know each other then," she said softly. "I am glad we do now." The barrister Alistair consulted the following day in London, a sharp-eyed man named Edmund Fairweather, with a reputation for taking on cases others considered too dangerous to touch, reviewed the manifests with careful, methodical attention, before finally looking up at Alistair with grim satisfaction. "This is more than enough to bring formal charges," Fairweather said, "provided the shipping clerk is willing to testify to the authenticity of these documents in court. Whitmore's connections will make this difficult, Your Grace. I will not pretend otherwise. But difficult is not impossible, particularly with evidence this thorough and a witness willing to speak the truth." Alistair returned home that evening with cautious hope for the first time in 2 years, only to find Serafina waiting for him, with news of Whitmore's visit that transformed his hope immediately back into fury and fear in equal measure. Her warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, while Alistair had ridden into London to quietly consult with a barrister he trusted, Serafina received an unexpected visitor at Ashbourne House. She recognized the man immediately from the brief description Alistair had once given her. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in the fine but understated clothing of a man who wished to appear more modest than his true wealth allowed. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, meeting him in the drawing room with Mrs. Whitfield hovering nervously nearby. "I was not aware we were expecting visitors." "Forgive the intrusion, Duchess," Whitmore said, his smile pleasant, practiced, entirely at odds with the coldness in his eyes. "I heard whispers in London that certain old documents belonging to the late Edward Kane had resurfaced. I thought it best to address the matter directly, one reasonable person to another, before misunderstandings grow into something neither of us would prefer." Serafina kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse hammered painfully in her ears. "I am not certain what documents you mean, Mr. Whitmore." "I think you understand perfectly well," he said, his tone shifting subtly, the pleasantness thinning to reveal something harder beneath. "I have built a comfortable life, Duchess, through considerable effort and considerable risk. I do not intend to see it dismantled now because a young bride went digging through a dead boy's belongings out of idle curiosity. I would strongly advise you and your husband to consider carefully what value there truly is in stirring up old grief that will not bring anyone back, and might instead bring a great deal of trouble to a household that has only just begun to find some peace." "Is that a threat, Mr. Whitmore?" "It is a friendly suggestion," he said, his smile never wavering, though the warning beneath it was unmistakable now. "Accidents happen, Duchess, even to careful people. I would hate for anything unfortunate to befall a woman so recently, so happily married." Serafina felt cold fury settle over her fear. steadying her voice despite the tremor she felt in her hands. "I do not respond well to threats, Mr. Whitmore, however friendly you dress them in. I suggest you leave this house before my husband returns and finds you here making them directly to his wife." Whitmore studied her for a long moment, something almost like grudging respect flickering behind the coldness in his eyes, before he inclined his head and took his leave, his carriage disappearing down the long drive with unhurried, deliberate calm that somehow frightened her more than open aggression would have. When Alistair returned that evening and heard what had happened, his fury was immediate and absolute, though beneath it, Seraphina saw genuine fear as well, fear for her safety that mirrored her own concern for his. "He came here, into my own house, to threaten you," Alistair said, pacing the length of the study, with barely contained rage. "I should have anticipated this. I should never have left you alone while pursuing this." "You could not have known," Seraphina said gently, though her own hands still trembled faintly with the memory of the encounter. "And I refuse to be frightened into silence, Alistair. Edward deserved justice. So does every family who lost money to that man's schemes, believing their losses were simple bad luck rather than deliberate theft." Alistair stopped his pacing, crossing the room to take her hands in his expression fierce with a protectiveness that warmed her despite the fear still lingering in her chest. "I cannot lose you as well, not after everything. I would rather let Whitmore keep his stolen fortune than risk losing you to whatever he is capable of." "You will not lose me," Seraphina said firmly, "but we cannot simply hide from this either. If we do nothing, he wins entirely, and Edward's death remains buried beneath lies forever. We must be clever, Alistair, and careful, but we cannot stop now." They spent the following days working quietly together, consulting with the barrister Alistair trusted, gathering additional testimony from the shipping clerk who had helped Edward 2 years before. The clerk, a nervous, thin man named Peter Hollis, met with them only after Alistair assured him repeatedly that his position and his safety would be protected regardless of the outcome, that the Kane family would stand behind him publicly rather than allow him to face Whitmore's anger alone the way Edward once had. "I have carried this guilt for 2 years, Hollis admitted quietly, seated stiffly in the Ashbourne house study, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. "I gave young Master Edward those manifests, because I believed he meant to see justice done quietly, through proper channels, without ever placing me at risk. When he died so soon after, I told myself it was coincidence, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. I have regretted my silence every single day since." "You are not responsible for what happened to my brother," Alistair said, his voice steady despite the old grief still evident beneath it. "Whitmore is responsible, and only Whitmore, but I would be grateful for your help now, in finally bringing that responsibility into the light where it belongs." Hollis nodded slowly, some of the fear in his posture easing into quiet resolve. "Then I will testify, Your Grace. Whatever the cost, it is long past time someone did." With Hollis's agreement secured, Fairweather began the careful, deliberate work of building a formal case, gathering additional witnesses among Whitmore's other defrauded business partners, several of whom, once they learned they were not alone in their losses, agreed to add their own testimony to the growing weight of evidence against him. Seraphina discovered, in the careful, methodical work of building their case, a partnership with Alistair, unlike anything she had expected when she signed those cold marriage papers months before. He listened to her suggestions, valued her instincts, treated her as a true equal, in a fight that mattered more than either of their lives had ever mattered separately. Late one night, as they reviewed the final gathered evidence together by candlelight in his study, Alistair set down his pen and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and unguarded, and entirely without the careful walls he had built around himself for 2 long years. "I pushed everyone away after Edward died," he said quietly. "I told myself it was strength, protecting what remained of my family by refusing to let anyone else close enough to hurt me again. But it was fear, Seraphina, only fear wearing strength's disguise. I was afraid that if I let myself care for anyone the way I cared for him, I would only lose them too, and I did not think I could survive losing someone that way twice." "And now?" she asked softly. "Now I find I have let you in anyway, without ever quite deciding to," he said. "And I find I am no longer afraid of what that means. I think, somewhere between the wedding I never wanted and this fight we are building together, I fell in love with you, Seraphina. Entirely, and without any of the careful control I promised myself I would maintain." Seraphina felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and warm, and she reached across the desk to take his hand in hers. "I fell in love with you too, Alistair. Somewhere between the cold study where you barely looked at me, and this study now, where you have finally let me see all of you. I did not expect it. I did not want it, not at first. But I would not trade it now for anything." He rose and crossed to her side of the desk, drawing her gently to her feet, and for the first time since their wedding day, he kissed her, softly at first, then with a growing certainty that spoke of every careful wall finally, completely falling away between them. Outside, the estate lay quiet and dark beneath a sky full of distant stars, and inside, in a study that had once held nothing but cold business between two strangers, something far warmer and far more real had finally, fully bloomed. But the danger Whitmore represented had not disappeared simply because their hearts had finally found each other. His threat still hung over them, and Serafina understood, even in the warmth of this new certainty between them, that the fight to bring him to justice, and to keep each other safe while doing so, had only just truly begun. Smoke curled from a fire that had no business burning near the stables, and Serafina smelled it before she saw the orange glow flickering against the night sky. She woke Alistair with a sharp shake of his shoulder, both of them rushing to the window to find the old hay barn near the eastern fields fully ablaze, flames climbing high enough to light the entire grounds in flickering, dangerous orange. "That barn does not catch fire on its own," Alistair said grimly, already reaching for his boots. Whitmore. By the time the household staff and nearby tenants had gathered enough hands to contain the blaze, the barn was a smoking ruin, though thankfully no lives had been lost, and the fire had not spread toward the main house or the cottages beyond it. A stable hand found evidence near the barn's foundation the following morning, the unmistakable smell of lamp oil where no lamp should have been stored, proof enough that the fire had been set deliberately. "He is sending a message," Alistair said, pacing his study with barely restrained fury. The manifests and testimony they had gathered spread across his desk. "He knows we are close to bringing formal charges, and he means to frighten us into silence before we can finish." "Then we do not give him the chance to try anything worse," Serafina said, though fear coiled tightly in her chest at the thought of how much closer to real danger they now stood. Fairweather said the case was nearly ready. "We move now, before Whitmore has time to plan anything further." Before they departed for London, Serafina insisted on visiting the tenant families nearest the burned barn, wanting to reassure herself personally that no one had been harmed, and that the families understood the fire had nothing to do with any fault of their own. She found them shaken but grateful, several of the men having joined the effort to contain the blaze despite the late hour, and she thanked each of them personally, promising that whoever was responsible would answer for the danger they had placed on innocent families. One elderly tenant, a widow named Margaret Doyle who had lived on the estate for over 30 years, took Serafina's hand in both of hers as she prepared to leave. "You have done more for this estate in a few short months, Your Grace, than anyone managed in the years before you arrived. Whatever trouble has found its way to your door, know that this estate stands behind you and His Grace both." The words stayed with Serafina throughout the ride to London, a quiet reminder of everything at stake beyond simply her own safety, or even Edward's memory. An entire community depended on the outcome of the fight they were about to wage, and she found renewed resolve in that knowledge. Resolve she carried with her into Fairweather's office that afternoon. They rode to London together that same day, meeting with Fairweather in his cramped, paper-filled office to review the final state of their evidence. The barrister listened grimly to the account of the fire, his expression hardening with each detail. "This changes matters," Fairweather said. "Arson against a duke's property, intended clearly as intimidation, is itself a serious crime. Separate from the fraud and the suspected role in your brother's death 2 years ago, I believe we have enough now to move immediately, formally and publicly. I would suggest we do exactly that, before Whitmore has time to react to whatever else he might be planning." Formal charges were filed within the week, the accusations spreading through London society with the speed such scandal always seemed to travel. Whitmore, cornered publicly for the first time in 2 years of careful, comfortable deception, did not go quietly. He sent a final letter to Ashbourne House, delivered by an unmarked courier late one evening, its message brief and unmistakably threatening. "You have made a grave miscalculation, Your Grace," it read. "I have spent 2 years building protections you cannot begin to imagine. Withdraw these charges, quietly, and I will consider the matter settled. Continue, and you will discover precisely how far I am willing to go to protect what is mine." Alistair's hands shook with fury as he read it, though this time fear for Serafina's safety outweighed even his anger. "I will not risk you for this. Whatever justice Edward deserves, I cannot lose you chasing it." "You are not choosing between justice for Edward and my safety," Serafina said firmly, taking the letter from his hands and setting it aside. Whitmore has already shown he is willing to burn your property and threaten your household regardless of whether we pursue formal charges or not. Withdrawing now buys us nothing but his continued freedom to harm someone else the way he harmed Edward. We finish this, Alistair, together, and carefully enough that he cannot touch either of us in the process. They devised a plan with Fairweather's careful guidance, one that would draw Whitmore into a final, undeniable confrontation, while ensuring Seraphina's safety remained protected throughout. Fairweather arranged, through careful diplomatic channels, for several of Whitmore's most powerful associates in Parliament to be present at a formal hearing, where the evidence would be presented publicly and in full, removing any opportunity for the case to be quietly dismissed behind closed doors, the way Whitmore clearly hoped it might be. The hearing took place in a crowded chamber. London's most prominent merchants and lawmakers gathered to witness a scandal that had already become the talk of every drawing room in the city. Whitmore arrived with the same practiced confidence he always wore, though Seraphina noticed, watching from her seat beside Alistair, that his composure seemed thinner than usual, his eyes darting toward the exits more than once, as Fairweather began methodically laying out the evidence against him. Peter Hollis testified first, his voice trembling initially but growing steadier as he described the falsified manifests, the private sales, the systematic theft carried out over years beneath a respectable public face. Whitmore's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the documentation Fairweather presented, page after page of undeniable proof, left little room for doubt among the gathered witnesses. Then Fairweather called forward 2 additional witnesses, business partners who had lost significant sums to Whitmore's schemes, both of whom had believed, until recently, that their losses were simple misfortune rather than deliberate theft. Their testimony, combined with Hollis's account and the recovered manifests, painted a picture too complete and too damning for even Whitmore's powerful friends to easily dismiss. Finally, Alistair himself rose to speak, his voice steady despite the 2 years of grief carried in every word. "My brother Edward discovered this fraud 18 months before his death," he said, addressing the gathered chamber directly. He confronted Mr. Whitmore about it privately, intending to resolve the matter quietly, without public scandal. Days later he was dead, in a hunting accident that has never sat easily with anyone who examined the circumstances closely. I do not claim to possess proof of murder beyond reasonable doubt, but I do possess proof of motive, proof of opportunity, and proof that the man before you built a fortune on lies thorough enough to warrant far more scrutiny than he has ever received. A murmur swept through the chamber, and Whitmore's face, for the first time since the hearing began, showed genuine alarm rather than practiced composure. He rose abruptly, attempting to address the chamber directly, his voice sharp with the first real crack Seraphina had heard in his careful confidence. "This is nothing but grief seeking someone to blame," Whitmore said. "A tragic accident, twisted years later into accusation by a family unable to accept simple, terrible misfortune." "Then explain the manifests, Mr. Whitmore," Fairweather said calmly, holding up the recovered documents for the chamber to see clearly. "Explain the insurance claims for cargo that never left London's docks. Explain the private sales recorded under a second, unregistered account bearing your signature. Grief does not forge shipping records, sir. Only deliberate deception accomplishes that." Whitmore had no answer that satisfied the gathered chamber, his protests growing increasingly desperate as witness after witness, document after document, stripped away the respectable facade he had maintained for so long. By the hearing's end, the chamber's presiding lord ordered a full formal investigation, including renewed examination of the circumstances surrounding Edward Kane's death, with Whitmore's assets frozen pending the outcome. Whitmore left the chamber a broken man, his powerful friends already distancing themselves from a scandal too thoroughly proven to survive association with, and within the month, further investigation uncovered evidence connecting him directly to the hired hands present during Edward's death, men who, faced with formal questioning at last, finally admitted the shot that killed Edward Kane had not been the accident everyone had been told for 2 long years. News of the full investigation spread quickly through London and back to the estate itself, and when Alistair and Seraphina returned home a few days later, they found the household staff and several tenant families gathered near the entrance, having heard whispers of the outcome, and wanting to see their Duke and Duchess return safely with their own eyes. Mrs. Whitfield, usually so composed and formal, embraced Seraphina without any of her usual restraint, tears openly in her eyes. "We feared for you both," the housekeeper admitted. "When word of the fire reached the village, and then the hearing, we did not know what to expect. I am so very glad to see you both returned home safely, your graces." Alistair, visibly moved by the gathered welcome, addressed the small crowd with a warmth Seraphina had never heard from him in public before. This estate has endured a great deal of grief these past 2 years. Grief I carried largely in silence, believing that was the only way to protect what remained of my family and this household. I was wrong. The truth, however painful, has finally been brought into the light, and Edward can finally rest knowing his death will not go unanswered. I am deeply grateful to every one of you for your patience and your loyalty through these difficult years, and especially grateful to my wife, without whose courage none of this would have been possible. A quiet cheer rose from the gathered staff and tenants, and Serafina felt tears prick her own eyes at the genuine warmth surrounding them, a stark contrast to the cold, isolated arrival she had experienced on her wedding day only months before. Justice, when it finally arrived, did not undo the grief of 2 years lost, did not return Edward to the family who still missed him every single day, but it brought something Alistair had not realized he still needed until it finally arrived, a truth spoken plainly and publicly, a wrong finally acknowledged rather than buried beneath silence and fear. That evening, back at Ashbourne House, Alistair stood once more at the window of Edward's old room, though this time Serafina stood beside him rather than watching from the doorway. "He can finally rest," Alistair said quietly, looking out over the darkened grounds. "I did not realize how much of my anger was simply grief, with nowhere to go until today. Now, finally, it has somewhere to go, and that's where your wife. He would be proud of you," Serafina said softly, slipping her hand into his. "Not simply for finding the truth, though that matters greatly. Proud that you let someone in enough to help you carry it, rather than bearing all of it alone the way you tried to for 2 years. Alistair turned to face her fully, something profoundly open in his expression, all the careful walls he had built around himself finally, completely gone. "I did not expect, when I signed those papers all those months ago, that I would find someone who could stand beside me through something like this. I thought I was securing a convenient, quiet arrangement. Instead, I found a partner braver and more steadfast than I ever imagined asking for." "You did not ask for it," Serafina said, smiling gently. "I simply refused to let you face it alone, however much you insisted you preferred it that way." "I am deeply grateful for your stubbornness then," he said, a genuine smile breaking fully across his face, warm and unguarded, in a way she had never once seen from him during those first cold weeks of their marriage. He drew her close, and for a long, quiet moment they simply stood together in Edward's old room, the space no longer feeling like a tomb sealed away from the living, but like a room finally allowed to breathe again, its grief honored rather than hidden. Later that night, in the east wing that had once been forbidden to her entirely, Alistair led her not to separate rooms but to a single chamber they had begun, over recent weeks, to quietly share. There was no cold contract between them now, no careful business arrangement dressed up in wedding vows. There was only two people who had found each other through grief and defiance and slow, hard-won trust, choosing each other now not because papers demanded it, but because their hearts, finally, freely, wanted nothing else. "I love you," Alistair said quietly, drawing her close in the candlelight. "Not the Duchess required by contract, but you, Serafina, exactly as you are, stubborn and brave and utterly unwilling to let me hide from either grief or joy." "I love you too," she answered, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart that had once seemed carved entirely from stone, and had proven, in the end, to be simply waiting for someone patient enough to find the warmth still living beneath it. "Whatever bound us together at the start, Alistair, I am glad, more than I ever expected to be, that it led me here. To you." Outside, the grounds of Ashbourne House lay quiet beneath a clear autumn sky, the old barn's ashes already being cleared for rebuilding, the estate finally settling into a peace it had not known in 2 long years. Inside, in a house that had once felt more like a fortress than a home, 2 people who had begun as strangers bound by obligation now stood together as something far stronger, forged not by contract but by choice, by courage, and by a love neither of them had expected to find, yet neither of them would now ever willingly let go. Spring arrived at Ashbourne House with a warmth the old estate had not seen in years, the gardens bursting into color after a long winter that had, at last, ended in something resembling peace. Serafina stood at the edge of the rose beds she had personally ordered replanted, watching as new growth pushed through soil that had, for 2 long years, been left neglected alongside so much else in this house. Whitmore's trial had concluded 3 months earlier, the evidence too overwhelming for even his most powerful connections to rescue him from formal conviction. He had been found responsible not only for the fraud that funded his fortune, but for orchestrating Edward's death through the 2 hired men who had finally confessed under the weight of undeniable evidence and the promise of leniency in exchange for the full truth. Whitmore's assets had been seized and distributed among the families he had defrauded over the years, a small measure of justice for losses that had gone unacknowledged for far too long. The Kane family name, once whispered about in connection to scandal and cold isolation, had begun instead to be spoken of with genuine respect throughout London society, a transformation Serafina still found remarkable when she considered how far both she and Alistair had traveled since that first cold meeting in his study. Alistair found her among the roses that morning, his stride far lighter now than the careful, guarded pace she remembered from their earliest days together. He carried a small bundle of letters, recently delivered, and something in his expression suggested news worth sharing. "An invitation," he said, holding up one particular letter, "from Lord Pemberton, requesting our presence at a summer gathering. He wishes to formally introduce us as the leading example of a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than mere convenience. It seems our story has become something of a favorite topic in certain drawing rooms." Serafina laughed, a sound that had grown far more frequent in recent months. "How strange, to think our disaster of a courtship has become fashionable inspiration." "Not entirely a disaster," Alistair said, drawing her close, his hand warm against the small of her back. "I would not change a single difficult step of it, if changing it meant losing where we ended up instead." They walked together through the gardens, past the tenant cottages that had been fully repaired now, their roofs sound against every storm the coming seasons might bring, past the rebuilt barn standing proud where the old one had burned, a physical symbol of everything they had survived and rebuilt together. The estate hummed with a quiet, contented energy that had been entirely absent when Serafina first arrived as a reluctant, frightened bride. Camilla Ashworth, it turned out, had left London society entirely following the scandal of Whitmore's trial, her earlier association with him through mutual social circles proving embarrassing enough that she chose to retreat to a distant relations estate in the countryside, rather than face the whispers that inevitably followed. Serafina felt no satisfaction in the woman's departure, only a quiet hope that wherever Camilla had gone, she might eventually find whatever genuine happiness had clearly eluded her here. Margaret, Serafina's own maid from her earlier life, had joined the Ashbourne house staff permanently now, delighted to remain in her lady's service, even as that lady's circumstances had transformed so dramatically from those difficult early days following her father's death. She often remarked, with the easy familiarity of long service, that she had never seen Serafina so thoroughly, genuinely happy. "You look at him the way your mother used to look at your father," Margaret told her one afternoon, helping arrange fresh flowers throughout the main hall. "Before her illness took that light from her eyes, I confess I worried, on your wedding day, that you were walking into a life of cold obligation. I am deeply glad to have been wrong." "I worried the very same thing," Serafina admitted. "I signed those papers expecting nothing more than survival, a roof kept over my head, and my family's debts settled. I never imagined I might find something like this waiting on the other side of that cold arrangement." Alistair, too, had changed in ways the household noticed daily. He no longer retreated to his study for entire evenings, no longer avoided social gatherings with the same fierce determination that had once defined him. He laughed more easily now, teased Serafina gently over breakfast, allowed himself small moments of genuine joy that had been entirely absent during those first difficult months of grief and isolation. One evening, as the household prepared for the summer gathering at Lord Pemberton's estate, Alistair found Serafina in her study, reviewing correspondence from several charitable organizations she had begun supporting, drawing on the estate's now properly managed resources to fund efforts helping widows and families who had suffered financial ruin, similar to what her own family had once faced. "You continue to surprise me," he said, leaning against the doorframe, watching her work with clear affection in his expression. "I do not think I have met anyone with your particular combination of stubbornness and genuine kindness." "I learned stubbornness from surviving my father's debts," Serafina said, glancing up with a small smile. "And I learned kindness from watching you slowly remember how to offer it, once you finally allowed yourself the chance." He crossed the room and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, lingering there a moment longer than necessary. "I have news, actually, that I have been waiting for the right moment to share." Something in his tone caught her attention immediately, and she set down her pen entirely, giving him her full focus. "What news?" "I have been in correspondence with several members of Parliament these past weeks," Alistair said, "regarding reforms to how shipping insurance claims are verified, closing the very loopholes Whitmore exploited for years before Edward ever caught wind of his schemes. I have been asked to formally testify before a committee reviewing the matter, and to help draft language that would prevent similar frauds from harming other families the way ours was harmed." Serafina felt pride swell warmly in her chest. Edward would be proud, watching you turn this tragedy into something that protects others from suffering the same fate. I could not have found the courage to pursue any of this without you standing beside me through the worst of it, Alistair said quietly. You gave me back a version of myself I thought I had lost entirely the day Edward died. I do not know how to properly thank you for that, beyond simply promising to spend the rest of my life trying. You do not owe me thanks, Serafina said, reaching up to cradle his face gently in her hands. You owe me nothing at all, Alistair. What we have built together, we built together, each of us choosing the other freely, even after those papers no longer felt like the reason we remained. That summer, the Ashbourne name became known throughout London, not for cold isolation or old scandal, but for genuine partnership, for a duke and duchess who had weathered grief and danger together, and emerged stronger for having faced it honestly, rather than hiding from it separately. Invitations poured in from every corner of society, though Alistair and Serafina accepted only the gatherings that genuinely interested them, having both learned, through hard experience, the value of protecting their peace rather than chasing approval from people whose opinions mattered little in the end. As autumn approached once more, nearly a full year after that first cold meeting in his study, Alistair surprised Serafina with a small, private ceremony held in the gardens she had so lovingly restored. Nothing formal or grand, simply the two of them and a handful of trusted staff who had become something closer to family over the difficult, transformative months they had shared. This is not required by any contract, he said, taking her hands beneath the same rose arbor where Camilla had once tried to diminish her confidence, now blooming full and fragrant in the golden autumn light. I only wish to marry you again, properly this time, choosing you freely with my whole heart, the way I should have been given the chance to choose you from the very beginning. Serafina felt tears gather, warm and joyful, rather than the fearful tears she had fought back on her actual wedding day nearly a year before. I choose you too, Alistair. Not the Duke bound by his uncle's arrangement, but the man who let me see him fully, grief and fear and warmth all together, and trusted me to stay regardless. They exchanged simple vows beneath the blooming roses, no lawyers present, no papers requiring signature, only two people who had begun as strangers bound by obligation and had built, through patience and courage and stubborn refusal to accept less than genuine partnership, a love neither of them had expected yet both of them now could not imagine living without. The cold Duke of Ashbourne that London society had once whispered about no longer existed, replaced instead by a man who had finally allowed himself to be fully known, fully loved, and fully alive again after 2 long years lost to grief and isolation. And the frightened young woman who had once walked into that cold study, prepared only to survive a marriage she never wanted, had become instead a duchess who had defied every expectation placed upon her, and in doing so, had found a love more genuine and more lasting than anything a contract alone could ever have promised her. Later that evening, as the small gathering shared a quiet supper laid out beneath lanterns strung through the garden trees, Mrs. Whitfield raised a glass and offered a toast that captured, more simply than any grand speech could have managed, everything the household had witnessed over the past difficult, extraordinary year. To a duke who remembered how to hope, she said, and to a duchess who never once let him forget it was worth trying. Laughter and warm applause followed, and Serafina, seated beside Alistair with his hand resting easily in hers, felt a contentment she had never expected to find on the other side of that cold contract signed so many months before. She thought of her father, gone now well over a year, and hoped, wherever he was, that he understood his daughter had not simply survived the arrangement her uncle forced upon her, but had built something far richer from its cold beginning than anyone watching that first stiff signing could ever have predicted. Alistair caught her looking thoughtful and leaned close, his voice low and warm against her ear. Where have you gone in that clever mind of yours? Only remembering how far we have traveled, she said, from that cold study to this garden. I would walk that entire difficult road again, he said. Every cold silence and every hard truth, if it meant arriving here again, beside you. She smiled and rested her head against his shoulder, watching the lantern light flicker gently across the roses around them, and understood that whatever challenges the future might still bring, she would face them exactly as she had faced everything since that first frightened morning in her father's study, without fear, without apology, and always, now, with Alistair standing steadily beside her. Ashbourne House, once a fortress built to keep the world out, had finally become what it was always meant to be, a home, warm and alive, filled with laughter and light, and the quiet, steady joy of two people who had chosen each other, fully and freely, against every cold beginning that had once threatened to keep them apart forever.